1934. Palm Beach is quiet in the early morning heat. The Atlantic moving in slow, indifferent rhythm beyond walls of coral stone and iron gates. Inside a sprawling oceanfront estate built on steel money, Margaret Carnegie Phipps takes her final breath. She is 74 years old, the widow of one of the richest men in America, and the daughter of the man who once controlled the furnaces that lit the night sky over Pittsburgh. The servants move softly through hallways lined with European tapestries. Outside, palm fronds bend in the wind. There's no smoke here, no clang of metal, no roar of molten iron pouring into molds. Only silence. But the silence is deceptive. Because what lies behind these walls is not simply grief. It is a fortune born in fire, and a dynasty already beginning to fracture. 4 years earlier, in 1930, her husband, Henry Phipps Jr., had died with far less public ceremony than his boyhood friend and business partner, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie built libraries across continents and wrote books defending wealth. Phipps avoided reporters, preferred privacy, and rarely gave speeches. Yet when Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901, forming U.S. Steel, Henry Phipps walked away with an estimated $50 million in bonds and securities. It was one of the greatest liquidations of industrial wealth in history. And unlike many magnates of his era, Phipps kept much of it intact. Now, in 1934, that steel fortune sits divided among heirs embedded in trusts, tied to mansions in Manhattan and winter palaces in Florida. From Fifth Avenue to Palm Beach, the Phipps name is engraved in limestone and whispered in drawing rooms. But the blast furnaces that made it possible are cooling. The Great Depression has already shaken Wall Street. Industrial America is changing. Steel no longer guarantees dominance. Capital flows elsewhere now, into finance, into new industries, into abstractions. Margaret's passing marks more than the end of a matriarch. It marks the end of the generation that understood where the money came from. She was born Margaret Carnegie, raised in a world where the smoke of Pittsburgh meant progress and power. She married into that same world and watched it multiply. But her children would inherit not the mills, not the noise, not the negotiations with labor or railroads. They would inherit bonds, estates, investments. They would inherit distance. Beyond the estate walls, Palm Beach continues its rituals. Society lunches resume. Polo matches are scheduled. The Phipps homes remain immaculate, their lawns trimmed, their facades unmoved by economic panic. To an outsider, nothing appears unstable. There is no scandal, no bankruptcy, no dramatic collapse. Only a quiet transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The steel that built the fortune required consolidation, risk, and relentless control. The wealth it produced does not. And when wealth no longer requires unity, unity begins to dissolve. In the decades ahead, the mansions will be sold or demolished, subdivided or repurposed. The name will survive on institutions and plaques. The fortune will endure in investment portfolios. But the dynasty, coherent, centralized, defined by industry, will begin its slow and almost invisible fragmentation. In Palm Beach that morning, as the ocean keeps moving and the estate gates remain closed, the age of industrial steel quietly gives way to something softer, more dispersed, and far less permanent than stone. Long before the mansions rose along Fifth Avenue and the palms took root in Florida sand, there were two boys in Pittsburgh who shared a classroom and a restless impatience with poverty. One was the son of a Scottish weaver who believed in self-education and relentless ambition. The other was the son of a modest businessman who understood accounts and discipline. Their names were Andrew Carnegie and Henry Phipps Jr., and their partnership would help forge the industrial backbone of the United States. Carnegie would become the public philosopher of wealth, the apostle of libraries and peace. Phipps would become the quiet accumulator, the man who kept the books balanced while furnaces burned through the night. Henry Phipps was born in 1839, a year before Carnegie, into a Pittsburgh that was still finding its industrial identity. The city sat at the confluence of rivers, perfectly positioned for transport and trade, but it was steel that would define it. As young men, Carnegie and Phipps worked first in telegraphy and railroads, learning the rhythms of American expansion. Railroads demanded iron, and iron demanded scale. When Carnegie began investing in iron mills and later in steel, Phipps followed not as a spectator but as a partner. Where Carnegie possessed vision and a talent for persuasion, Phipps brought method. He was the administrator, the financial stabilizer, the one who translated ambition into operating structure. By the 1870s and 1880s, their enterprise had evolved into what became the Carnegie Steel Company. It was not simply another manufacturer. It was an experiment in vertical integration. The company controlled mines, railroads, coke production, and mills. It squeezed costs, reinvested profits, and adopted new technologies faster than competitors. The Bessemer process and later open-hearth furnaces allowed steel to be produced at unprecedented scale. Bridges, skyscrapers, rail lines, all of it required steel, and Carnegie Steel provided it. Pittsburgh's skyline glowed orange at night, lit by molten metal poured into forms that would become the skeleton of modern America. Henry Phipps did not give speeches about destiny or democracy. He rarely granted interviews. Yet he held one of the largest stakes in the enterprise. He oversaw finances with precision, ensuring that expansion did not outpace solvency. In an age when many industrialists over-leveraged themselves into ruin, Phipps favored caution within growth. Dividends were calculated carefully. Investments were structured conservatively. If Carnegie was the visible architect of the empire, Phipps was its structural engineer, reinforcing beams behind walls the public never saw. The labor unrest of the era tested the steel industry's moral and economic foundations. The Homestead Strike of 1892 would stain Carnegie's reputation permanently. Although Phipps was less publicly associated with the conflict, he remained part of the leadership structure that confronted organized labor with force. The mills demanded control. The owners defended it. The profits that flowed afterward carried the weight of that violence. Steel built fortunes, but it did not build them gently. By the late 1890s, the American steel industry had reached a tipping point. Competition intensified, consolidation loomed, and financiers in New York recognized that control of steel meant control of infrastructure. In 1901, banker J.P. Morgan orchestrated the acquisition of Carnegie Steel and other major producers to form U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Carnegie sold his interests for approximately $480 million, becoming one of the richest men in the world. Phipps, holding a substantial stake, received an estimated $50 million, largely in bonds and securities rather than volatile equities. It was a staggering sum. Adjusted for inflation, it represented wealth on a scale that could purchase cities. The transaction marked more than a financial exit. It marked a philosophical divergence. Carnegie embraced philanthropy with evangelical zeal, funding libraries, universities, and peace initiatives. Phipps, by contrast, withdrew from industrial leadership and avoided spectacle. He relocated much of his life to New York and later to Florida, channeling his fortune into real estate, investments, and selective philanthropy. He endowed what would become the Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, a glass palace of horticulture that contrasted sharply with the smoke-choked mills that financed it. It was beauty funded by blast furnaces. What distinguished Phipps was not only the size of his fortune but its structure. Many Gilded Age magnates retained controlling interests in active enterprises, binding their heirs to corporate governance. Phipps converted much of his wealth into income-producing securities and trusts. He reduced operational exposure. He insulated the family from industrial volatility. In doing so, he ensured survival through downturns, including the Panic of 1907 and later the Great Depression. But he also removed the next generation from the discipline and unity required to run a consolidated empire. By the time of his death in 1930, Henry Phipps had transformed from steel executive to financial patriarch. The furnaces of Pittsburgh still operated, but they no longer answered to him. His wealth existed in diversified portfolios, prime real estate, and structured inheritances. The partnership that began in a Pittsburgh classroom had culminated in one of the most successful exits in American industrial history. Yet that exit carried an unintended consequence. Without an operating core, without mills to manage or industries to defend, the family's cohesion depended solely on inheritance structures and social bonds. The steel itself outlived both. FOUNDERS U.S. Steel continued as a titan of industry, navigating wars, depressions, and global competition. But the Phipps name drifted away from production and into society columns. The transition from operator to investor appears subtle in financial ledgers, but culturally it is profound. An industrial dynasty derives identity from control of tangible enterprise. A financial dynasty derives identity from capital allocation. The former requires coordination and shared strategy. The latter permits fragmentation. In the glow of Pittsburgh's furnaces, Henry Phipps helped build the architecture of modern America. In the quiet of New York drawing rooms and Palm Beach estates, he transformed that architecture into generational wealth. It was a triumph of timing and prudence. Yet, embedded within that prudence was the seed of dispersal. The mills had demanded unity. The bonds did not. And as the 20th century advanced, the steel that once defined the family would become only a historical origin story remembered in biographies, engraved on conservatory plaques, but no longer binding heirs to a common industrial purpose. Long before Palm Beach and Fifth Avenue, before coral stone facades and winter lawns trimmed by silent gardeners, there was Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, smoke-choked, river-bound and restless with ambition. It was here, in the shadow of iron furnaces and along the muddy banks of the Allegheny River, that the story of the Phipps fortune truly began. Henry Phipps Jr. was not born into wealth. He was born in 1839 to English immigrant parents who understood thrift, discipline, and survival. His childhood bore little resemblance to the polished world his descendants would later inhabit. There were no estates, no carriages waiting at the curb. There were only narrow streets, modest means, and the steady hum of an America industrializing at breakneck speed. In that same neighborhood lived another boy who would shape Henry's destiny, Andrew Carnegie. The two families shared more than proximity. They shared immigrant roots, shared ambition, and shared the understanding that opportunity in America required calculation as much as courage. Their friendship began in youth but matured in commerce. When Carnegie entered the railroad industry as a telegraph operator and later as a railroad executive's protege, he opened doors not only for himself but for Phipps as well. The steel story did not begin with furnaces. It began with railroads, with iron rails stretching westward, binding the continent together and demanding ever stronger materials to support expansion. The Civil War accelerated everything. Iron production surged. Railroads multiplied. Capital flowed into heavy industry. Carnegie recognized early that steel, not iron, would define the future. The Bessemer process, which allowed for cheaper and faster steel production, transformed manufacturing economics. Carnegie moved aggressively, consolidating mills, negotiating contracts, and pushing competitors aside. And at every stage, Henry Phipps stood beside him, not as the public visionary, not as the celebrated philanthropist, but as the disciplined financial architect of the operation. Where Carnegie excelled in rhetoric and expansion, Phipps excelled in structure and restraint. He managed costs, tracked capital, and imposed fiscal order on what could have become reckless growth. By the 1880s, their partnership controlled some of the most productive steel operations in the United States. The Carnegie Steel Company expanded across Pennsylvania, absorbing competitors and refining production efficiency. At the heart of this expansion stood facilities like the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, emblematic of the industrial might reshaping America. Carnegie Steel Company became synonymous with vertical integration, owning mines, railroads, and mills to eliminate dependency. It was ruthless, efficient, and enormously profitable. Yet the mills were not romantic. They were grueling. Workers endured long hours in blistering heat. Labor unrest simmered beneath the surface of industrial triumph. In 1892, the Homestead Strike would erupt into violence, drawing national attention to the brutal tensions between capital and labor. Though Carnegie was abroad during the strike and his partner Henry Clay Frick became the public face of confrontation, the conflict cast a long shadow over the entire enterprise. Phipps, characteristically reserved, avoided public commentary. But he understood what the strike represented. Industrial consolidation came with human cost. Despite turbulence, profits soared. By the turn of the century, Carnegie Steel dominated American production. And then, in 1901, the defining transaction occurred. Financier J.P. Morgan orchestrated the purchase of Carnegie Steel, merging it into what would become U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. The sale was staggering. Carnegie personally received hundreds of millions in bonds. Henry Phipps, as a principal partner, secured an estimated $50 million. It was not simply wealth. It was industrial transformation converted into financial permanence. But here, the divergence begins. Carnegie turned outward, devoting his fortune to philanthropy, libraries, universities, peace foundations. His name became synonymous with giving. Phipps chose another path. He withdrew. He left Pittsburgh. He moved his family east to New York and wintered in Palm Beach. He invested conservatively in real estate and bonds. He avoided spectacle. He rarely granted interviews. He did not write manifestos on wealth. If Carnegie sought legacy and public memory, Phipps sought stability and private structure. In New York, the Phipps family commissioned townhouses along Fifth Avenue, participating in the architectural transformation of Manhattan into a corridor of old money display. Yet even these homes reflected restraint compared to the flamboyance of other Gilded Age families. The Phipps estates projected solidity, rather than excess, stone rather than marble, tradition rather than experimentation. The fortune was not meant to dazzle. It was meant to endure. As the 20th century progressed, the industrial origins of the wealth grew more distant. The children of Henry Phipps were raised not in Pittsburgh's smoke, but in refined drawing rooms and private schools. They inherited trusts instead of stock certificates tied to active management. The mills no longer required oversight. Dividends arrived predictably. The fortune became abstract numbers on paper, rather than molten steel poured into molds. Yet abstraction changes behavior. The first generation builds. The second preserves. The third interprets. Some members of the family entered public service, others philanthropy, others private investment. The unifying force of industry, of shared risk and shared oversight, no longer bound them together. Wealth dispersed into branches. Estates multiplied, then diversified. Manhattan residences stood apart from Palm Beach villas. Investment portfolios expanded into sectors far removed from steel. And all the while, America transformed. The Great Depression tested even the most secure fortunes. Industrial dominance yielded to financial sophistication. Steel remained vital, but it no longer symbolized the frontier of economic power. The Phipps name endured, but it did so quietly, almost invisibly. Compared to the louder legacies of their contemporaries, what makes the Phipps story distinct is not scandal or collapse. It is subtle erosion. The original partnership between Carnegie and Phipps was forged in shared struggle and disciplined coordination. Once the mills were sold and the fortune secured, that central engine disappeared. The wealth became decentralized, managed through trusts designed to protect rather than expand. Protection, however, is not the same as unity. The mansions would later stand as monuments to this transition, structures financed by industrial might, yet inhabited by heirs far removed from furnaces and labor disputes. Their walls held paintings, not production schedules. Their windows overlooked oceans, not rail yards. And as decades passed, maintenance costs, inheritance divisions, and changing social norms would slowly undermine the permanence those structures were meant to symbolize. In tracing the rise of the Phipps fortune, one sees the arc of American capitalism itself: immigrant ambition, industrial consolidation, financial conversion, and eventual diffusion. The smoke of Pittsburgh gave way to the sea breeze of Palm Beach. The clang of steel softened into the hush of private estates. And while the fortune remained substantial, the cohesive force that created it had already begun to dissolve. The dynasty did not shatter overnight. It simply expanded outward, generation by generation, until the center, once forged in iron and discipline, became little more than memory dot by the early decades of the 20th century. The Phipps fortune had detached itself completely from the furnaces of Pittsburgh and rerouted in stone, marble, and oceanfront land. The industrial clangor that once defined its origin had been replaced by architectural permanence. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and the manicured coastline of Palm Beach, where the family's residences stood not merely as homes but as declarations of arrival. In New York, the Phipps townhouses rose among the grandest private dwellings of the Gilded Age. Neighbors to the Astors and Vanderbilts, their facades designed in dignified European styles that emphasized heritage over flamboyance. Unlike some contemporaries who favored theatrical opulence, the Phipps aesthetic leaned toward controlled grandeur, heavy stonework, classical symmetry, restrained ornamentation. These were not experimental palaces. They were fortresses of stability. The Fifth Avenue residences commissioned by Henry Phipps Jr. reflected his philosophy of wealth, visible but not theatrical, powerful but not reckless. The homes were expansive, often occupying entire corners of prime Manhattan blocks, yet they maintained a quiet authority. Interiors were filled with European art, tapestries, and carved wood paneling imported from abroad. Ballrooms and salons hosted society gatherings that reinforced the family's position within New York's elite. But unlike some Gilded Age magnates who chased constant publicity, Phipps preferred distance. His houses were not platforms for spectacle. They were enclaves of privacy. At the same time, another chapter was unfolding further south. Palm Beach, once a modest coastal settlement, had been transformed into a winter haven for America's industrial aristocracy. Railroads made the journey accessible. Fortunes made it fashionable. Here, amid tropical landscaping and the Atlantic breeze, the Phipps family constructed sprawling estates that rivaled their northern counterparts in scale. These properties, set behind gates and hedges, were designed to capture both exclusivity and leisure. They blended Mediterranean revival and classical influences, echoing European villas while adapting to Florida's climate. Palm Beach offered what Pittsburgh never could: sunlight, distance, and seasonal escape. It was within these estates that the next generation matured, removed almost entirely from the industrial context that had created their inheritance. The children of the steel era learned etiquette before enterprise. They inherited shares and trusts rather than responsibilities tied to production. The shift from active management to passive wealth was subtle but decisive. Once U.S. Steel had absorbed the original enterprise, the Phipps fortune no longer required day-to-day oversight of mills and labor contracts. Bonds yielded steady returns. Real estate appreciated. Investments diversified quietly through conservative financial strategies. Yet permanence in architecture can conceal fragility in cohesion. The Fifth Avenue mansions were built during an era when private residencies defined status. But as the 20th century progressed, social patterns shifted. Maintaining such properties required extensive staff, constant renovation, and increasing taxation. What had once symbolized solidity gradually became a logistical burden. Heirs inherited not just wealth but upkeep. And while the fortune remained considerable, its division among multiple branches of the family introduced complexity. In Palm Beach, the estates functioned as seasonal courts of aristocracy. Winter social calendars revolved around dinners, charity galas, and equestrian events. The Phipps name carried weight, but it did so quietly, without the theatrical self-promotion seen in other families. The privacy that Henry Phipps had cultivated became part of the family identity. Unlike the Rockefellers or Vanderbilts, whose philanthropic foundations and public institutions amplified their narratives, the Phipps legacy was more understated. There were contributions to horticulture, medical institutions, and civic causes. Yet they were often executed without aggressive branding. As decades passed, the cultural relevance of such mansions began to evolve. The Great Depression forced many elite families to reconsider the sustainability of enormous private residences. Some properties were sold. Others were subdivided. Urban development pressures in Manhattan made townhouses less practical than apartment living. The rise of cooperative buildings along Park Avenue signaled a new form of elite residence, luxurious yet less burdensome than maintaining an entire mansion. Slowly, one by one, several Gilded Age homes were demolished to make way for modern high-rises. Stone gave way to steel and glass once again, though in a different architectural language. In Palm Beach, however, land itself became the enduring asset. Oceanfront property grew more valuable as the century advanced. Estates that once symbolized exclusivity became even more prized as surrounding development intensified. Yet, even here, generational transition altered ownership patterns. Some heirs chose to sell rather than maintain. Others modernized properties, reshaping historic structures to suit contemporary tastes. The unity of a single patriarchal vision dissolved into individualized decisions. This was the paradox of inherited industrial wealth. The original fortune had required cooperation, discipline, and centralized authority. Its maintenance required only investment strategy. Without the necessity of collective oversight, branches of the family naturally diverged. Marriages introduced new surnames, new alliances, new geographies. Some descendants remained in New York society. Others relocated, pursuing private interests far removed from steel or high society. The dynasty did not implode. It dispersed. The architectural legacy remains a visible reminder of that earlier cohesion. Photographs of the original Fifth Avenue mansions capture an era when private homes rivaled European palaces. Palm Beach estates continue to evoke the golden age of winter aristocracy. Yet many of the original New York residences no longer stand, replaced by commercial towers or modern apartment blocks. The physical markers of unity proved less permanent than the financial instruments designed to preserve capital. In the end, the Phipps mansions tell a story not of scandal but of transition. They were built at the moment when industrial America reached its zenith and converted steel into stone. They flourished during an era when concentrated wealth sought architectural expression. And they began to fade as society redefined luxury, efficiency, and status. The fortune that constructed them did not evaporate. It adapted, diversified, and endured. But the houses, those grand embodiments of a steel dynasty, became relics of a specific time. Symbols of a world in which wealth was centralized, industrial, and visibly anchored in masonry. Standing before photographs of those estates today, one sees more than architecture. One sees the arc of American capitalism, its rise from immigrant labor to industrial dominance, its conversion into financial abstraction, and its eventual diffusion across generations. The Phipps name survives in institutions and investment portfolios. Yet the mansions reveal the deeper truth. Even fortunes forged in steel cannot guarantee cohesion forever. Stone may endure for decades, but dynasties require something more fragile than walls. By the mid-20th century, the steel that had once defined the Phipps name existed only as a financial memory. Its heat converted into dividends and diversified portfolios. The furnaces of Pittsburgh no longer required their oversight, and the boardrooms that replaced mill floors demanded a different temperament altogether. What confronted the heirs of Henry Phipps Jr. was not the challenge of building an empire, but the subtler, more complex task of preserving identity without industry. Wealth had become systematized, protected within trusts administered by advisors, buffered against volatility. Yet protection can also insulate. And insulation can distance a family from the very forces that once unified it. The early decades of the 20th century had already demonstrated how swiftly economic climates could shift. The Great Depression rattled even the most secure families. And though the Phipps fortune remained largely intact due to conservative investment strategies, the illusion of invulnerability dissolved. Industrial supremacy no longer guaranteed perpetual dominance. The United States emerged from World War II transformed, suburbanized, consumer-driven, financially sophisticated. Old industrial fortunes increasingly coexisted with new corporate wealth born in technology, manufacturing, innovation, and finance. Steel was no longer the frontier. It was infrastructure. Within this evolving landscape, the Phipps heirs charted divergent paths. Some gravitated toward philanthropy, aligning themselves with medical research institutions, horticultural initiatives, and civic projects that reflected both discretion and continuity. Others immersed themselves in private investment and real estate management, expanding portfolios rather than public reputations. The family's relative quietude contrasted sharply with more publicly visible dynasties, where the Rockefellers built institutional empires with their name emblazoned across universities and cultural centers. The Phipps presence often remained understated, woven into boards and foundations without spectacle. The very structure of inherited wealth began to shape generational behavior. Trust instruments ensured distribution, but they also diffused control. Unlike the original partnership between Phipps and Andrew Carnegie, which had required constant coordination and strategic unity, the descendants operated within financial frameworks that minimized the need for collective decision-making. Income arrived predictably. Real estate holdings appreciated steadily. Investment managers handled diversification. The central engine that once required collaboration had been replaced by mechanisms designed for autonomy. New York society itself was changing. The grand Fifth Avenue mansions that symbolized permanence at the turn of the century were increasingly impractical. Rising property taxes, staffing costs, and urban development pressures made private palaces less sustainable. By mid-century, many Gilded Age homes were demolished, their lots converted into commercial towers or luxury apartment buildings. The city's elite adapted, trading single-family mansions for cooperative residences that offered privacy without the burdens of maintenance. In this shift, architecture mirrored economics. Efficiency replaced monumentality. Palm Beach, however, retained its role as a winter enclave for inherited wealth. There, estates continued to function as seasonal centers of social gravity. Yet, even in Florida, generational transition introduced fragmentation. Heirs inherited properties with varying degrees of attachment. Some saw historical continuity. Others saw liquidity. Selling an estate no longer implied failure, it reflected a modern understanding of capital allocation. Oceanfront land could be subdivided, redeveloped, or monetized in ways unimaginable to the original builder. The post-war era also ushered in cultural democratization. The rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age softened as media exposure and expanding education altered perceptions of status. Old money still mattered, but it no longer monopolized influence. The Phipps descendants navigated a society in which visibility could be either asset or liability. Many chose the safer route of discretion, reinforcing a family identity grounded in privacy rather than prominence. Yet privacy carries its own cost. Without a singular patriarch or matriarch guiding collective vision, branches of the family pursued distinct trajectories. Marriages expanded networks beyond traditional industrial aristocracy. Geographic dispersion increased. Some heirs engaged deeply in philanthropy. Others maintained lower profiles, focusing on personal ventures. The fortune endured, but the concept of a centralized dynasty grew increasingly abstract. By the late 20th century, America's economic power centers had shifted again. Finance eclipsed manufacturing as the dominant force shaping national wealth. Investment banks, hedge funds, and multinational corporations redefined accumulation. Ironically, the steel fortune that once represented industrial cutting edge now functioned as capital within the very financial systems that supplanted heavy industry. The transformation was complete. What began in molten metal concluded in diversified securities. Throughout this period, the Phipps name rarely surfaced in scandal or sensational headlines. Its trajectory was characterized not by implosion, but by gradual diffusion. This subtlety is precisely what makes the story compelling. There were no dramatic bankruptcies, no courtroom spectacles, no public feuds that shattered the family image. Instead, there was quiet adaptation. The mansions that once anchored identity became optional assets. The mills that demanded unity faded into historical memory. What remained was wealth considerable, durable, yet increasingly detached from its origin story. In examining this phase, one confronts a broader question about inherited industrial fortunes. Can a dynasty remain cohesive when the industry that forged it disappears from daily life? For the first generation, survival depended on strategic coordination. For subsequent generations, survival depended on prudent management. These are not equivalent forces. Coordination for creation binds individuals through shared risk. Management for preservation allows independence. The Phipps heirs demonstrated discipline in safeguarding capital. But discipline alone cannot replicate the psychological cohesion of shared enterprise. The steel partnership between Carnegie and Phipps had been forged through negotiation, expansion, and confrontation. It required presence. By contrast, the later custodians of the fortune operated through structures designed to minimize confrontation and maximize continuity. As the 20th century approached its close, the Phipps fortune remained substantial, yet its identity as a steel dynasty had largely dissolved. The name persisted in philanthropic circles and investment portfolios, but the imagery of furnaces and railroads had receded into historical archives. The mansions stood, or in some cases, no longer stood, as reminders of an era when industrial capital demanded physical expression in stone. What emerges from this period is not decline in the conventional sense, but transformation. The steel fortune did not fracture through scandal or collapse. It fractured through dispersion, through time, geography, and generational autonomy. The unity that once characterized the dynasty gave way to individual stewardship. And while the capital endured, the singular narrative of a family bound by industry became increasingly difficult to sustain. In that gradual shift lies the quiet turning point of the Phipps legacy. Not a fall, not a failure, but a redefinition. The dynasty, forged in the heat of 19th century industry, entered the cool, calculated realm of modern finance. The blast furnaces were silent. The estates were quieter still. And within that silence, the cohesion that once defined the family became something remembered rather than lived. By the 1970s and 1980s, the United States no longer resembled the nation that had forged the Phipps fortune. The steel towns of Pennsylvania were entering visible decline. Their mills shuttered or downsized as global competition intensified and manufacturing migrated elsewhere. Pittsburgh, once defined by smoke and molten iron, began reinventing itself through healthcare, education, and technology. The irony was unmistakable. The industry that had created the Phipps wealth was fading in the very city where it had once seemed invincible. Yet the family fortune, long separated from direct steel operations since the 1901 formation of U.S. Steel, remained insulated from the collapse of American heavy industry. It had already evolved into diversified capital, buffered by real estate and conservative investment structures first shaped under Henry Phipps Jr. This insulation, however, deepened the generational divide between origin and inheritance. For descendants coming of age in the late 20th century, steel was not memory but abstraction. It existed in family lore, in archived photographs of mills, in philanthropic plaques bearing ancestral names. Their world revolved around board memberships, foundations, and investment committees rather than production schedules and labor negotiations. The discipline that once required coordination among industrial partners had been replaced by professional asset management. Wealth functioned through accountants and attorneys. Risk was calculated, diversified, minimized. Palm Beach continued to symbolize continuity. Yet, even there, the landscape was changing. Oceanfront estates built during the early 20th century faced mounting pressures, property taxes, hurricane maintenance, shifting architectural tastes. Some properties were renovated extensively, modernized to align with contemporary luxury standards. Others were sold, sometimes demolished to make way for larger, more technologically advanced residences. The land itself grew more valuable than the original structures. What had once been statements of permanence became negotiable assets within a dynamic real estate market. In New York, the transformation was even more pronounced. The grand Fifth Avenue mansions that defined the Gilded Age had largely disappeared by the late 20th century. Commercial towers and cooperative apartment buildings replaced single-family palaces. The city's elite adapted to vertical living, where exclusivity was defined by square footage within towers rather than entire blocks of limestone facades. The disappearance of these mansions did not signify financial distress for families like the Phipps. It reflected an urban evolution. Yet symbolically, it marked the erosion of a visible dynasty. Architecture had once anchored identity. Without it, legacy became less tangible. During this period, members of the extended Phipps family remained active in philanthropy and civic life, often supporting medical research, environmental conservation, and cultural institutions. The family's association with horticulture and botanical initiatives endured, echoing early 20th century interests in public gardens and green spaces. These endeavors reinforced an image of cultivated stewardship rather than industrial dominance. The emphasis was on preservation of institutions, of land, of capital. Creation had belonged to the founders. Custodianship defined their successes. Meanwhile, American society grew increasingly transparent. Media expansion and financial journalism brought scrutiny to wealth and privilege. Unlike some dynasties that found themselves entangled in high-profile controversies or business upheavals, the Phipps family largely avoided sensational exposure. Their discretion functioned as both shield and identity. Yet discretion also meant that the narrative cohesion of the dynasty faded from public consciousness. The name survived, but its origin story blurred into broader industrial history. The concept of a unified family enterprise grew even more diffuse as generational branches multiplied. Marriages extended networks beyond traditional old money circles. Some descendants pursued careers in finance or entrepreneurship independent of inherited structures. Others embraced philanthropic leadership or private pursuits. Geographic dispersion accelerated. Not all heirs remained anchored to New York or Palm Beach. With each generation, personal autonomy expanded, and collective coordination diminished. This dispersion was not catastrophic. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. The trusts established in earlier decades continued to function, distributing income and safeguarding principal. Real estate holdings, when retained, appreciated significantly in value. Investment portfolios adapted to shifting economic climates, moving through equities, bonds, and alternative assets as financial markets evolved. From a purely fiscal perspective, the fortune demonstrated remarkable durability. Yet durability is not the same as dynasty. A dynasty implies narrative continuity, a shared purpose rooted in origin. For the Phipps family, that origin lay in partnership with Andrew Carnegie and the rapid industrialization of America. But as steel receded from the national spotlight and manufacturing ceded primacy to finance and technology, that origin story felt increasingly remote. Heirs might visit Pittsburgh's revitalized neighborhoods or museums that commemorated industrial history, yet their daily realities bore little resemblance to the furnace-lit nights of the 19th century. By the end of the 20th century, the American economy had become globalized and digitized. Capital flowed instantaneously across borders. Investment strategies grew more complex, leveraging derivatives and international markets. Within this environment, inherited wealth required professional management of a sophistication unimaginable to earlier generations. The fortune's survival depended less on industrial foresight and more on financial acumen. The symbolic fracture of the dynasty did not occur through scandal or insolvency. It unfolded through normalization. The Phipps wealth became one among many established fortunes navigating modern capitalism. Without a central operating company to bind them, descendants interacted more as relatives than as business partners. The shared endeavor that once demanded unity had long since concluded with the sale of Carnegie Steel, and yet there remained a quiet through line. The ethos of caution, conservatism, and privacy instilled by Henry Phipps persisted. Even as architecture changed and industries evolved, the family's approach to wealth retained a disciplined character. Avoidance of ostentation, preference for stability over speculation, and emphasis on philanthropy rather than spectacle continued to shape decisions. In this sense, the dynasty's fracture was not a collapse but a diffusion of values across independent lives, standing at the threshold of the 21st century. The Phipps story revealed its defining paradox. The fortune forged in steel proved resilient precisely because it had detached from steel early. By converting industrial dominance into diversified capital at the moment of its peak, the founders insulated future generations from the cyclical decline of heavy industry. Financially, the strategy succeeded. Culturally, however, it diluted the singular narrative that once unified the family. The mills no longer roared. The mansions that once symbolized permanence had either evolved or vanished. The heirs moved quietly through boardrooms and philanthropic circles, guardians of a legacy few could fully trace. In this quiet evolution lay the true fracture, not of wealth, but of cohesion. The steel fortune endured. The dynasty, as a centralized force shaped by shared enterprise, receded into history, leaving behind estates, endowments, and a name etched subtly into the architecture of American industrial memory died as the 21st century advanced. The Phipps fortune entered a world unrecognizable to the men who had forged it in iron and risk. Global markets operated around the clock. Capital moved digitally across continents, and wealth itself became increasingly intangible. The blast furnaces that had once defined American supremacy were now historical exhibits, preserved in museums or reduced to skeletal relics along rivers once thick with smoke. For the descendants of Henry Phipps Jr., the inheritance no longer carried the scent of coal or the urgency of consolidation. It carried statements from investment managers, reports from philanthropic boards, and responsibilities that were cultural rather than industrial. In this era, the meaning of old money shifted. Wealth once tied to visible infrastructure, railroads, steelworks, mines had evolved into diversified portfolios spanning equities, private equity, venture capital, and global real estate. The Phipps capital, structured carefully in earlier generations, adapted to these changes with the same conservatism that had characterized its origin. The family's low public profile persisted. There were no dramatic reinventions into flashy tech moguls, no aggressive branding campaigns to reintroduce the name to a modern audience. Instead, there was continuity through discretion. Palm Beach remained a symbolic anchor. The town itself transformed into one of the most concentrated enclaves of wealth in the United States, attracting hedge fund managers, financiers, and global billionaires. Estates grew larger, security more sophisticated, architecture more technologically advanced. Some historic properties changed hands at record-breaking valuations, reflecting the escalating value of exclusivity. For families like the Phipps, whose presence in Palm Beach dated back to the early 20th century, the town represented continuity amid change. Yet even here, generational transitions altered the emotional attachment to specific properties. What had once been family seats evolved into negotiable assets within an appreciating market. New York followed a parallel transformation. Fifth Avenue's identity shifted from residential grandeur to luxury retail and high-rise living. The grand townhouses that once symbolized industrial triumph had largely disappeared, replaced by towers of steel and glass, ironically echoing the very material that had financed the originals. The Phipps name no longer commanded a physical block of Manhattan real estate. Instead, its presence persisted more subtly, through philanthropic affiliations and private investment interests, woven into the city's financial fabric. Throughout these changes, the legacy of partnership with Andrew Carnegie remained an enduring historical footnote. Carnegie's philanthropic empire became globally recognized, his libraries and foundations immortalizing his name. The Phipps contribution, though equally foundational to the steel empire's financial architecture, stayed comparatively understated. This asymmetry shaped public memory. Carnegie became a symbol of American industrial ambition and philanthropy. Phipps became a quieter figure, indispensable yet less mythologized. For descendants, This difference reinforced a tradition of privacy rather than public narrative building. The modern era also introduced new social expectations surrounding inherited wealth. Transparency, corporate governance, and social responsibility gained prominence. Philanthropic endeavors faced scrutiny regarding impact and accountability. In response, many established families professionalized their foundations, employing experts to oversee charitable strategies. The Phipps-related institutions adapted accordingly, aligning traditional giving with contemporary frameworks emphasizing measurable outcomes. The ethos of stewardship persisted, but its execution evolved. At the same time, broader cultural conversations questioned the legitimacy and influence of inherited fortunes. Economic inequality became a national debate. Industrial-era wealth, once celebrated as evidence of American opportunity, faced re-evaluation in light of modern labor and capital dynamics. For families rooted in 19th-century accumulation, navigating this environment required sensitivity. Public restraint became both cultural habit and strategic choice. Visibility could invite critique. Discretion offered stability. Within the family itself, generational autonomy expanded further. Descendants pursued diverse careers and personal interests, sometimes independent of inherited capital. Education opened pathways into finance, academia, entrepreneurship, and the arts. The Steele origin story functioned less as directive and more as backdrop. Identity diversified. Some branches maintained stronger connections to traditional social circles. Others blended into broader professional networks. The cohesion that once revolved around a single enterprise had long since given way to individualized trajectories. Yet the structural resilience of the fortune remained evident. Conservative financial management insulated capital from extreme volatility. Real estate assets, particularly in markets like Palm Beach, appreciated dramatically during economic booms. Investment diversification reduced exposure to sector-specific decline. Unlike many industrial fortunes that eroded through mismanagement or overextension, the Phipps wealth demonstrated continuity rooted in caution. And still, the notion of dynasty continued to evolve. In the industrial age, dynasty implied command over production and labor. In the modern age, it implied continuity of capital and influence. The Phipps family embodied the latter. There was no central corporation bearing their name in global headlines, no singular patriarch orchestrating strategy. Instead, it's enough. There was a distributed network of heirs managing inherited assets within established financial systems. This distribution marked both strength and subtle fracture. Strength because it reduced systemic risk and allowed adaptation. Fracture because it dissolved the unified narrative of creation. The mills of Pittsburgh had demanded cooperation and strategic unity. Modern wealth management required professional expertise, but not familial cohesion. Over time, shared enterprise gave way to shared lineage. Looking back across generations, one sees a fortune that successfully transitioned from industrial dominance to financial durability. The decision in 1901 to convert steel into bonds and securities insulated the family from the decline that later consumed American manufacturing. That strategic pivot secured wealth for over a century. Yet it also severed the daily connection between family and industry, transforming builders into custodians. In the present day, the Phipps name persists in carefully maintained institutions and in the quiet corridors of investment. It does not dominate headlines, nor does it court attention. The estates that once symbolized industrial might now represent historical chapters within an evolving narrative of American wealth. The steel that forged the fortune has long cooled, but its capital continues to circulate through modern markets. The fracture of the dynasty was never explosive. It was incremental, unfolding across decades as architecture changed, industries shifted, and generations diversified. What remains is not a collapsed empire, but a dispersed legacy, financially resilient, culturally restrained, historically significant. The story of the Phipps mansions and the steel fortune that built them is ultimately a study in transformation. From furnace to foundation, from consolidation to distribution, From visible empire to quiet endurance. In the quiet spaces between board meetings and seasonal migrations to Palm Beach, the question that lingered for the Phipps heirs was not whether the fortune would survive, but what it meant to inherit something forged in an age of smoke and labor conflict. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the physical symbols of the dynasty, the Manhattan townhouses, the original configurations of the Palm Beach estates, had either vanished or evolved beyond recognition. What endured was capital, carefully structured since the days when Henry Phipps, Jr. chose prudence over spectacle after the sale that formed U.S. Steel. That decision, made at the apex of industrial expansion, insulated future generations from the turbulence that later consumed American manufacturing. Yet insulation has consequences. It preserves wealth while slowly dissolving the shared urgency that once bound its creators. The cultural climate of the modern era placed inherited fortunes under a different kind of scrutiny. Industrial magnates of the 19th century were once celebrated as nation builders. By the 21st century, concentrated wealth invited questions about inequality, legacy, and responsibility. Families rooted in the Gilded Age found themselves navigating a society that both admired and questioned their permanence. For the Phipps descendants, whose public posture had long favored discretion, this environment reinforced a tradition of quiet engagement. Philanthropy continued, often directed toward healthcare, environmental conservation, and botanical initiatives, fields that reflected continuity rather than reinvention. These contributions did not seek spectacle. They sustained institutions, funded research, and maintained gardens that served as living metaphors for stewardship. Yet beneath this measured continuity, generational identity continued to diversify. Unlike the founding era, when partnership with Andrew Carnegie required coordinated expansion and calculated risk, modern heirs operated within professionalized financial systems. Investment committees replaced industrial strategy sessions. Portfolio diversification replaced vertical integration. The daily demands of running mills and negotiating supply chains had vanished long before, and with them the necessity of unified command. Each branch of the family could pursue its own trajectory without threatening the overall stability of the fortune. Palm Beach, once a seasonal refuge for industrial aristocracy, evolved into a global nexus of finance and international wealth. Hedge fund founders and multinational investors joined the old names on its oceanfront. The architecture grew grander, security more discreetly sophisticated, and property valuations reached extraordinary heights. For families with historical roots there, including the Phipps, the town represented both legacy and liquidity. Estates built as enduring family seats became assets within a highly competitive real estate market. Decisions to renovate, sell, or subdivide reflected contemporary strategy rather than ancestral symbolism. In New York, the transformation was even more emblematic. Fifth Avenue no longer belonged to private dynasties. It had become a corridor of global commerce and vertical luxury. The limestone facades that once announced industrial power had largely been replaced by towers of steel and glass structures whose materials echoed the very industry that had financed their predecessors. The disappearance of the original mansions marked more than architectural change. It signaled the fading of a visible dynasty, replaced by anonymity within financial systems that no longer required physical monuments to assert dominance. The fracture of the Phipps dynasty did not emerge through scandal or financial collapse. It manifested through diffusion of purpose. The founding generation shared a singular mission: to build and consolidate steel production in an expanding nation. Subsequent generations inherited the results without the imperative of construction. Their mission became preservation, adaptation, and discretion. Wealth became background rather than engine. In this shift lay a subtle tension: how to honor industrial origins while operating in a post-industrial world. Education and professional opportunity further expanded the scope of identity among descendants. Some entered finance, others academia, others entrepreneurial ventures independent of inherited capital. The name opened doors, but personal ambition determined direction. This autonomy reflected the success of earlier financial structuring. Trusts and diversified investments allowed heirs to pursue varied paths without jeopardizing principal wealth. Yet autonomy also diluted collective narrative. The Phipps story, once tightly bound to Pittsburgh's furnaces, fragmented into individual biographies. Meanwhile, public memory increasingly favored figures whose legacies were institutionalized at scale. Carnegie's name remained globally recognizable through libraries and foundations. The Phipps contribution, though foundational to the steel enterprise's financial discipline, remained comparatively understudied in popular consciousness. This asymmetry underscored the family's long-standing choice, influence without overt branding. Their legacy persisted not in bold public monuments but in steady participation within philanthropic and financial networks. As the 21st century progressed, global crises tested even diversified fortunes. Market volatility, technological disruption, and geopolitical uncertainty required agile management. Yet the conservative ethos established by Henry Phipps continued to shape strategy. Risk was assessed carefully. Investments were balanced across sectors. Real estate holdings were evaluated with pragmatic detachment. The discipline that once governed industrial expansion now governed capital allocation. The mansions that once embodied permanence became historical chapters rather than central pillars. Some Palm Beach properties retained their grandeur. Others transformed under new ownership. Manhattan's vanished townhouses survived only in archival photographs. Architecture, it turned out, was less durable than carefully structured wealth. Stone could be demolished. Capital, when prudently managed, could endure. In reflecting on this era, the narrative of fracture becomes clearer. The dynasty did not shatter in crisis. It diffused across generations, geographies, and professions. What began as a unified industrial partnership evolved into a constellation of independent heirs linked by lineage rather than enterprise. The steel fortune remained intact, but the shared experience of building it receded into history. And yet, in that quiet evolution lies a different form of success. The Phipps fortune avoided the dramatic implosions that befell other industrial dynasties. It adapted without spectacle, preserved without rigidity, and navigated cultural shifts with discretion. The absence of scandal became its own distinguishing feature. In a society increasingly captivated by visibility and disruption, the Phipps legacy endured through steadiness. The dark story of the mansions and the steel fortune is not one of ruin, but of transformation. It is the story of how wealth forged in fire entered a world defined by finance and digital abstraction. It is the story of how architecture once symbolized unity, then yielded to economic pragmatism. And it is the story of a dynasty that did not collapse under pressure, but quietly dispersed, its capital intact, its narrative softened, its origins preserved in history rather than in the daily lives of those who inherited its name. By the time the 21st century reached full momentum, the Phipps legacy existed less as a visible dynasty and more as a quiet current within American financial and philanthropic life. The blast furnaces that once defined the family's origin were museum relics, and the architectural monuments that symbolized their arrival in New York and Palm Beach had either been transformed or replaced. Yet the capital remained structured, diversified, and shielded by the conservative instincts first solidified when Henry Phipps Jr. stepped away from direct industry after the creation of U.S. Steel in 1901. That decision, made at the apex of industrial power, proved to be the pivotal moment in determining the dynasty's future. It ensured survival. It also ensured distance. In a modern economy dominated by technology, private equity, and global finance, inherited industrial wealth occupies a peculiar position. It is respected, often envied, sometimes questioned, but rarely central to the engines of innovation that define contemporary influence. For the Phipps descendants, this meant navigating relevance without spectacle. The family name did not headline technology startups or multinational conglomerates. Instead, it appeared in quieter settings, philanthropic boards, conservation initiatives, healthcare institutions. Investment partnerships structured with deliberation rather than ambition. The evolution of Palm Beach illustrates this subtle recalibration of legacy. Once a seasonal retreat for America's industrial elite, it became a year-round hub for hedge fund executives, venture capitalists, and international magnates. Estates grew larger, transactions more expensive, and wealth more globally interconnected. The Phipps presence there, rooted in early 20th century acquisition, blended into a landscape increasingly defined by new money. The contrast was not confrontational. It was generational. Where steel once represented modernity, finance and technology now commanded that title. Old fortunes coexisted with new, their histories diverging even as their neighborhoods overlapped. In New York, the transformation was equally emblematic. Fifth Avenue's grand residences had long since yielded to commercial and vertical development. The Gilded Age palaces that once anchored family identity were replaced by towers, whose skeletal frames of steel and glass mirrored the industrial material that financed their predecessors. The physical disappearance of these mansions underscored a broader truth. Architecture can embody wealth, but it cannot preserve cohesion indefinitely. Without a unifying enterprise, estates become assets rather than anchors. Within the family, generational diversification continued to expand. Some descendants maintained active roles in philanthropic leadership, guiding foundations that reflected long-standing interests in medicine, environmental stewardship, and cultural preservation. Others pursued professional paths independent of inherited structures, integrating into global financial and academic networks. The trusts that safeguarded the fortune provided flexibility. They allowed autonomy without threatening principal wealth. But flexibility also meant that collective identity thinned across time. The shadow of partnership with Andrew Carnegie lingered in historical memory. Carnegie's narrative became synonymous with American philanthropy and industrial ambition. His libraries stand across continents, tangible monuments to his philosophy of wealth redistribution. The Phipps' contribution to that original enterprise financial discipline, structural oversight, partnership stability, remains less publicly celebrated yet equally foundational. This disparity shaped the public narrative. The steel empire's most visible symbol carried Carnegie's name. The quieter architect of its financial integrity faded into relative obscurity. As economic inequality became a central political and cultural discussion, inherited fortunes faced renewed scrutiny. Questions emerged about responsibility, transparency, and the social role of long-established wealth. Families rooted in 19th century accumulation navigated these debates cautiously. The Phipps tradition of discretion proved advantageous in such an environment. By avoiding flamboyance, they sidestepped much of the public criticism directed at more conspicuous fortunes. Yet this same discretion further obscured the cohesive story of the dynasty, rendering it less a household name and more a historical footnote in industrial America. The concept of fracture becomes clearer in this context. The Phipps dynasty did not implode under financial mismanagement. It did not disintegrate through scandal. Instead, it fragmented through diffusion of purpose and identity. The first generation had been bound by shared enterprise, risking capital, negotiating contracts, expanding production. Later generations were bound only by lineage and shared capital structures. Without the necessity of daily collaboration, unity became optional. And yet within that diffusion lay a quiet endurance. The conservative financial ethos established by Henry Phipps persisted through decades of economic transformation. The decision to convert industrial ownership into diversified securities insulated the family from the severe contractions that devastated other manufacturing fortunes in the late 20th century. As American steel declined in global competitiveness, the Phipps' wealth remained largely unaffected. The mills may have shuttered, but the capital they generated had already migrated into safer terrain. In the present era, legacy manifests not in smokestacks or limestone facades, but in balance sheets and endowments. The steel fortune circulates within global markets, supporting institutions and investments far removed from its origin. The mansions that once symbolized dominance serve as archival images, reminders of a period when wealth required architectural proclamation. Today, proclamation is unnecessary. Influence operates quietly, embedded within financial systems too, complex to anchor to a single surname. The dark undertone of this story lies not in tragedy but in erasure. The physical markers of industrial triumph have diminished. The shared experience of building an empire has vanished from living memory. What remains is capital robust, disciplined, resilient, but detached from the furnace-lit urgency that once defined it. The dynasty has not fallen. It is dissolved into modernity. In tracing this evolution, one sees the broader arc of American wealth itself. Industrial empires gave way to financial networks. Stone mansions yielded to digital portfolios. Centralized command transformed into distributed stewardship. The Phipps name survives, woven quietly into philanthropic and investment landscapes. But the cohesive dynasty forged in partnership and steel exists now primarily in history. The mansions stood as monuments to a moment when industry defined identity. Their gradual disappearance mirrors the transformation of that identity into something less visible yet more adaptable. The steel fortune that fractured a dynasty did so not through collapse, but through survival. It endured by evolving beyond the conditions that created it, leaving behind a legacy measured not in smoke or stone, but in the steady continuity of capital across generations. In the end, the story of the Phipps mansions and the steel fortune that built them does not conclude with bankruptcy, scandal, or a dramatic courtroom unraveling. It ends, or rather continues, in quiet persistence. The furnaces that once burned along the rivers of Pennsylvania have cooled into history, and the limestone facades that once lined Fifth Avenue have largely vanished into the vertical geometry of modern Manhattan. Palm Beach remains glittering and exclusive, but transformed by new money and global capital flows. And through all of it, the fortune, first disciplined under Henry Phipps Jr., endures. Detached from the clang of steel, yet still shaped by the caution that defined its architect. The defining moment of this dynasty occurred not in Palm Beach, nor in the demolition of a Manhattan townhouse, but in 1901, when the Carnegie Steel Empire was sold and folded into U.S. Steel. That transaction converted industrial dominance into financial permanence. It liberated the Phipps heirs from the operational volatility of manufacturing, even as it severed them from the shared enterprise that had unified the founding generation. In choosing liquidity over control of mills, Henry Phipps secured safety for his descendants. He also ensured that future generations would inherit wealth without inheriting the furnace-forged cohesion that created it. Across the 20th century, that decision revealed both its brilliance and its cost. Financially, the fortune survived world wars, depressions, inflationary cycles, and the decline of American heavy industry. The collapse of steel towns in the late 20th century did not dismantle the Phipps balance sheet. The capital had long since migrated into diversified investments and real estate holdings. When manufacturing faltered, the fortune remained steady. From a purely strategic standpoint, the insulation was extraordinary. But dynasties are not measured by capital alone. They are measured by continuity of purpose. The first generation of the Phipps legacy shared a mission with Andrew Carnegie to build, consolidate, and dominate a transformative industry. That mission required daily coordination, strategic risk, and relentless expansion. It forged identity through action. Once the mills were sold, that binding force dissolved. What remained was wealth to preserve rather than empires to build. The mansions embodied this transition. In New York, the Fifth Avenue residences proclaimed arrival into America's highest social tier. They were constructed of stone as if permanence could be purchased in blocks and mortar. Yet permanence proved conditional. Urban evolution, taxation, and changing tastes rendered private palaces impractical. One by one, they disappeared, replaced by towers whose steel frames echoed the material that financed their predecessors. In Palm Beach, estates endured longer, but even there, ownership shifted. Renovations altered original visions, and land itself became more valuable than architectural continuity. The fracture of the dynasty was subtle. There were no public feuds that shattered unity, no reckless speculation that drained coffers. Instead, there was dispersion. Trusts distributed income across branches. Heirs pursued independent careers and interests. Geographic anchors loosened. The family identity, once centralized around an industrial enterprise, became a constellation of individuals linked by surname rather than shared endeavor. Yet this dispersion also speaks to adaptation. The Phipps fortune did not implode under generational mismanagement as many industrial empires did. It avoided overextension. It avoided the temptations of spectacle. The conservative ethos established by Henry Phipps persisted as a quiet through line. Privacy became protection. Caution became continuity. In a century marked by financial bubbles and corporate collapses, restraint proved powerful. In the 21st century, the meaning of old industrial wealth has shifted again. Influence operates through global finance, technology, and networks that transcend geography. The Phipps name no longer commands public fascination, but it does not need to. Its capital functions within modern systems, supporting philanthropic institutions, participating in diversified markets, and maintaining a legacy of measured stewardship. The dynasty's visibility has faded, but its financial architecture remains intact. The dark dimension of this story lies not in moral failure, but in erosion of narrative. The shared memory of furnaces and railroads has dimmed. The experience of building something from immigrant beginnings into national dominance cannot be replicated by heirs, who inherit results rather than risk. Wealth secured through industry carries a different psychological weight than wealth managed through trusts. Over generations, that weight lightens. Identity softens. Purpose decentralizes. And yet perhaps this evolution was inevitable. Industrial America itself transformed. Steel yielded primacy to finance, then to technology. Architecture yielded to efficiency. Dynasties yielded to distributed wealth management. The Phipps story mirrors the arc of American capitalism. Consolidation, monetization, diversification, diffusion. It demonstrates how fortunes can survive by adapting even as the industries that created them decline. Today, the name Phipps surfaces quietly on institutional boards, in philanthropic acknowledgements, within financial partnerships structured far from public attention. The mansions that once stood as tangible declarations have largely receded into photographs and archives. But the capital remains active, circulating invisibly through markets that would have been unimaginable to 19th century steel magnates. The steel fortune that fractured a dynasty did so not through collapse, but through success. By converting industry into liquid wealth at its zenith, Henry Phipps ensured that his descendants would never again need to gather around furnace fires to protect their inheritance. He freed them from the volatility of production, and in doing so, he dissolved the necessity of unity. In that paradox lies the enduring lesson of the Phipps legacy. Wealth can be preserved. Estates can be bought and sold. Names can endure across centuries. But the cohesion that forms in the act of building, of risking, expanding, and forging something new is far more fragile. The mansions have changed. The mills are silent. The fortune survives. And the dynasty, once forged in steel, has become something quieter, a legacy sustained not by fire, but by careful stewardship in a world far removed from the heat that created it.